This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In the heart of rural Oklahoma lay the small town of Silver Creek, a place that seemed untouched by the complexities of the outside world. Nestled between rolling hills and open plains, Silver Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for generations, and where change came slowly, if at all. Life moved at a steady pace, dictated by the rhythms of the seasons, church services, and high school football games. In this seemingly idyllic community, the town's most revered institution was its high school, Silver Creek High, a place that had produced generations of graduates who would either stay and settle down in town or venture out into the world, only to return, drawn back by the comfort of home. Among the faculty at Silver Creek High, no one was more respected than Samuel Jennings, the school's long-standing history teacher. Samuel had taught at the school for over a decade, and in that time, he had earned a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable and passionate educators the town had ever seen. He was a tall man in his early 40s, with a reserved yet authoritative presence that commanded the attention of his students. His dark hair, peppered with streaks of gray, added to his dignified appearance, while his calm, serious demeanor gave him an air of wisdom that made him seem older than his years. He was known for his sharp, inquisitive eyes, which seemed to see everything happening in his classroom, and for the way he could silence a room with just a look. Samuel had grown up in a small town not too different from Silver Creek, but his ambitions had always been larger. In his youth, he had dreamed of becoming a historian, of traveling the world and uncovering the forgotten stories of the past. He had attended a prestigious university on the East Coast, where he studied history with fervor, losing himself in the stories of ancient civilizations, war strategies, and the rise and fall of empires. But life had taken a different course. After graduating, Samuel had returned to Oklahoma, taking up a teaching position in Silver Creek, a temporary job, or so he had thought at the time. Yet the years slipped by, and before he knew it, Samuel was entrenched in the life of Silver Creek High, the spark of his youthful ambitions dimming as the realities of small-town life settled over him. Despite this, Samuel took pride in his work. He was known as a dedicated and meticulous teacher, always prepared with detailed lesson plans and a depth of knowledge that far exceeded what was required. His love for history was genuine, and he had a talent for making it come alive for his students. Samuel believed in the power of education, in the importance of teaching the next generation to understand the world around them by learning from the past. He was strict but fair, holding his students to high standards, and most respected him for it. Over the years, many of his former students would return to visit, expressing their gratitude for the way he had shaped their understanding of history and their sense of responsibility to the world. Outside of school, however, Samuel led a solitary life. He had never married, nor did he have any children. He lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town, a small, neat place surrounded by fields. His home was quiet, a reflection of his personality, tidy, organized, and filled with books, most of them history texts and biographies of long-dead leaders. In the evenings, when he wasn't grading papers or preparing lessons, Samuel would sit on his porch, watching the sun set over the plains, the vast Oklahoma sky shifting from brilliant orange to deep indigo. He would sip his coffee and think of the life he had imagined for himself, long ago, a life filled with travel, adventure, and intellectual discovery, before pushing those thoughts aside and accepting the reality of the path he had chosen. Despite his solitude, Samuel was respected in the community. People saw him as dependable, a man of principle who had dedicated his life to educating the town's youth. He was a fixture at town events, though he rarely engaged deeply with others. At church on Sundays, he would sit in the same pew near the back, offering polite nods to those who greeted him, but rarely lingering for conversation. He was a man who seemed content in his own company, though there were whispers among some of the town's older residents that Samuel was lonely, that perhaps his quiet life was not as fulfilling as it appeared. But Samuel never gave any indication that he was anything other than satisfied with his place in the world. At school, Samuel was something of an institution. The students knew him as the teacher who expected the most from them, but also the one who cared deeply about their success. He was the teacher who never accepted half-hearted efforts, who pushed them to think critically, and who wouldn't hesitate to call them out if they weren't living up to their potential. His tests were famously difficult, his assignments rigorous, but there was a respect that came with his high expectations. He wasn't the teacher students confided in or joked with, but he was the one they worked hardest for. Samuel Jennings was a man who had a reputation to uphold, both in the classroom and in the community, and he carried that weight with quiet pride. Among his current students was Caleb Harris, a young man who in many ways was Samuel's polar opposite. Caleb was a bright student but rebellious, known for his charisma and his ability to charm his way out of trouble. He was popular, the kind of student who could skate by on minimal effort, relying on his natural intelligence and his social skills to get through school without ever really applying himself. He was well liked by his peers, and most of the teachers at Silver Creek High tolerated his antics because they recognized his potential. But not Samuel. Samuel saw in Caleb a student who was wasting his talents, someone who could achieve so much more if only he took things seriously. From the beginning of the school year, there had been tension between Samuel and Caleb. In Caleb, Samuel saw the embodiment of everything he despised in modern youth: entitlement, laziness, and a lack of respect for authority. Caleb, on the other hand, saw Samuel as an outdated relic, someone who took himself too seriously, and who didn't understand what it was like to be a teenager in today's world. Their clash was inevitable. Where Samuel valued discipline and hard work, Caleb thrived on rebellion and disruption. The two were locked in a power struggle from the start, each representing opposing forces that neither was willing to yield to. For Samuel, this struggle was more than just about a student misbehaving in class. Caleb represented a larger challenge to his authority, to the way he had always taught and lived his life. As the year went on, their relationship deteriorated further. Caleb's disruptions in class became more frequent, his dismissive attitude toward Samuel more blatant. He would make jokes at Samuel's expense, rolling his eyes when Samuel tried to discipline him. At first, Samuel responded with the same strictness he applied to all his students, believing that Caleb would eventually fall in line. But Caleb didn't. In fact, the more Samuel tried to assert his control, the more Caleb resisted, making it a game to see how far he could push the boundaries. The other students began to notice the tension, and though most of them respected Samuel, some started to side with Caleb, amused by his ability to rattle the usually composed teacher. Caleb's friends would laugh under their breath at his sharp remarks, fueling Caleb's need to continue challenging Samuel's authority. Samuel, who had always been able to maintain control over his classroom, began to feel that control slipping away. And for a man like Samuel, who had built his entire life on order, discipline, and respect, that loss of control was intolerable. As the months went on, Samuel's frustration with Caleb grew. He started to dread the days when Caleb's class was on his schedule, knowing that each session would be a battle. His once firm grip on the classroom was weakening, and the stress of it began to show in small ways. His temper flared more easily, his patience wore thin, and his usually meticulous lesson plans became hurried and unfocused. To those around him, it seemed like Samuel was simply dealing with the pressures of teaching, but inside, a deeper frustration was building, one that Samuel could not easily express or even fully understand. Caleb, for his part, seemed oblivious to the effect he was having on Samuel. To him, their interactions were just another part of the game, another way to assert his independence and challenge authority. He didn't see the growing anger behind Samuel's eyes, the way Samuel's jaw clenched every time Caleb spoke out of turn. Caleb's world was one of parties, football games, and teenage drama, and he saw Samuel as little more than an obstacle in his path. He never considered that the tension between them could escalate into something darker, something neither of them could control. But for Samuel, the pressure was building. His once orderly world was beginning to crack, and the more Caleb pushed, the more Samuel felt his grip on his carefully constructed life slipping. In Caleb, Samuel saw not just a disruptive student, but a challenge to his very identity as a teacher, a man of respect and authority. And as the weeks passed, that challenge became something far more personal, something Samuel would eventually feel compelled to address in the most tragic way possible. As the school year progressed, the tension between Samuel Jennings and Caleb Harris intensified, growing into a dangerous power struggle that began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a typical conflict between a strict teacher and a rebellious student escalated into something far more personal, something darker. Samuel's frustration with Caleb, once a simmering annoyance, evolved into a near obsession. Every interaction between them became charged with unspoken hostility, and every glance, every remark seemed to add fuel to the fire that was slowly consuming both of them. Caleb's defiance had always been present, but it became more deliberate as the months passed. What had once been playful rebellion, a way to amuse his friends or challenge authority, grew into a conscious effort to undermine Samuel's authority in front of the class. Caleb, ever the charismatic leader, seemed to thrive on the chaos he created. His classmates, many of whom once respected Samuel, began to follow Caleb's lead, laughing at his remarks, subtly encouraging his disruptions. For Caleb, it was a game, a way to show that he didn't need to conform to the rules that everyone else followed. His popularity shielded him from the usual consequences other students might face, and he knew it. Samuel, on the other hand, was losing his grip. His patience, once his strongest asset, had been worn thin by months of Caleb's insubordination. Every day, he walked into the classroom bracing himself for the next confrontation. He would stand at the front of the room, the weight of the students' eyes on him, trying to maintain his usual composure, but inside he was seething. Caleb's antics were no longer just an inconvenience, they were a direct challenge to Samuel's authority, to his belief in discipline and respect. Samuel had spent his entire career cultivating an image of control, of being the teacher who could handle any situation, but Caleb was chipping away at that image, and Samuel felt powerless to stop it. The power struggle between them became more than just a battle of wills, it became a symbol of everything wrong in Samuel's life. Caleb's defiance represented the larger feeling of loss that Samuel had been experiencing for years. As he watched the world around him change, students becoming more unruly, societal norms shifting, he felt increasingly out of touch, like an outsider in his own classroom. He had always believed in the importance of order, discipline, and respect, but Caleb's behavior seemed to mock those values at every turn. The more Caleb rebelled, the more Samuel felt his life slipping out of his control, not just in the classroom, but in every aspect of his existence. At first, Samuel tried to handle the situation the way he always had, with strict discipline and stern lectures. He would call Caleb out in front of the class, reprimanding him for talking out of turn or not paying attention. He assigned extra work, hoping that Caleb's behavior could be corrected with punishment. But none of it worked. Caleb's smirk never left his face, and if anything, the punishment seemed to embolden him. He would roll his eyes at Samuel's lectures, making it clear that he wasn't intimidated. Worse, Caleb's popularity only grew as his defiance became more brazen. His classmates admired him for standing up to Samuel, and this emboldened him further. Each act of rebellion was met with laughter and approval from his peers, deepening Samuel's sense of isolation. The tension between them was palpable, growing thicker with each passing day. In class, the atmosphere was always tense, like a powder keg waiting to explode. The other students, sensing the underlying hostility, began to behave differently as well. Some aligned themselves with Caleb, either out of admiration or fear, while others remained silent, not wanting to get involved but also not willing to challenge Caleb's authority within the group. The classroom, once a place of learning, had become a battleground, with Samuel and Caleb locked in a silent war that overshadowed everything else. Outside of school, Samuel's life began to unravel further. He couldn't escape thoughts of Caleb, even when he was at home, alone in his quiet house. What should have been moments of peace were instead filled with frustration and anger. He would sit in his living room, staring at the stacks of papers he needed to grade, but his mind would drift back to the classroom, to the smirk on Caleb's face, the defiance in his eyes. Samuel found himself replaying their interactions over and over, each time growing angrier, more convinced that Caleb was a threat not just to his authority but to his very sense of self. Samuel's frustration turned into obsession. He began thinking of ways to regain control, strategies to put Caleb in his place once and for all. His thoughts grew darker, more extreme, as he imagined scenarios where Caleb was finally forced to respect him. Samuel's pride, once a source of quiet strength, had turned into something corrosive. He couldn't stand the idea that a student, a child, was making a fool of him in front of the entire class. Worse, he felt that Caleb's defiance was a reflection of his own failure as a teacher, as a man. The more Caleb pushed, the more Samuel felt his identity slipping away, until all that remained was his desperation to reclaim what he had lost. For Caleb, however, the struggle wasn't nearly as deep or personal. To him, Samuel was just another authority figure to challenge, another obstacle in his path. Caleb was young, full of bravado, and confident in his ability to charm his way out of trouble. He didn't see the impact his actions were having on Samuel, didn't realize that what was a game to him was becoming something much more serious for his teacher. Caleb enjoyed the attention he received from his classmates, enjoyed the feeling of power that came with defying someone like Samuel. But he was also reckless, unaware of how far he was pushing Samuel toward the edge. The town of Silver Creek, like most small towns, was slow to notice the growing tension between Samuel and Caleb. To the outside world, everything seemed normal enough. Samuel was still the respected teacher, the one everyone trusted with their children's education, and Caleb was just another popular student pushing the boundaries. But inside the walls of Silver Creek High, the situation had become toxic. Teachers began to notice Samuel's frayed nerves, the way his temper seemed shorter than usual. His colleagues would comment on how he seemed distracted, less focused, but no one connected it to his escalating conflict with Caleb. Even the students, who were aware of the tension, didn't fully understand what was happening. To most of them, it was just an entertaining sideshow, something to gossip about in the hallways. They didn't see the deeper struggle going on inside Samuel's mind, the way his pride was being eroded day by day, the way his sense of control was slipping away. Caleb's friends would laugh about how easily he could get under Samuel's skin, bragging about his latest act of rebellion, as if it were a badge of honor. No one saw that what was happening wasn't just a clash of personalities, but a descent into something far more dangerous. The power struggle between Samuel and Caleb reached a new level when Caleb began to push the boundaries outside of the classroom. He would confront Samuel in the hallways, making snide comments just loud enough for Samuel to hear. In the parking lot after school, Caleb would loiter with his friends, laughing and making jokes at Samuel's expense as he walked to his car. These small, seemingly insignificant acts of defiance were like needles, each one pricking at Samuel's already raw nerves, driving him further into his obsession with controlling Caleb. It was no longer about discipline or respect, it was about winning a battle that had become personal. Samuel's mental state began to deteriorate. He became fixated on Caleb, unable to think of anything else. At night, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of how to put an end to the power struggle once and for all. His dreams, once filled with images of the historical figures he admired, were now plagued by visions of Caleb laughing, mocking, always just out of reach. Samuel's once orderly world had been turned upside down, and he felt powerless to stop it. By this point, Caleb had become more than just a rebellious student. In Samuel's mind, Caleb represented everything that was wrong in his life. He symbolized the loss of control, the erosion of respect, and the failure of everything Samuel had worked for. Samuel's once clear vision of himself as a dedicated, respected teacher was now clouded by rage and frustration. His thoughts grew darker, more dangerous, as he imagined what it would be like to finally silence Caleb, to put an end to the constant humiliation once and for all. In his obsession, Samuel began to lose sight of reality. The lines between right and wrong, between discipline and vengeance, blurred as he became consumed by his need to regain control. He started to rationalize his thoughts, convincing himself that he wasn't just fighting a rebellious student, he was fighting for his dignity, for his very identity. And in his increasingly unstable mind, there was only one way to win that fight. As the tension continued to build, it became clear that the situation could not be sustained much longer. Something had to give. Samuel's once unshakable sense of discipline had crumbled, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. Caleb's defiance, once a source of entertainment for him and his friends, had taken on a more dangerous edge as he unknowingly pushed Samuel closer and closer to the breaking point. The power struggle between them had reached a tipping point, and neither of them could see the tragedy that was about to unfold. The turning point came one afternoon, long after the final bell had rung and the school halls had emptied. The air was thick with the weight of a late autumn evening, the sun setting low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the nearly deserted parking lot of Silver Creek High. Samuel Jennings lingered longer than usual that day, sitting alone in his classroom, grading papers in a distracted haze. His mind, however, was far from the task at hand, replaying the events of the past few weeks, every snide remark from Caleb, every smirk, every act of rebellion that had chipped away at his authority. His frustration, which had been simmering beneath the surface, was now a full-blown storm inside him. Samuel had reached his limit. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt calm or in control. The constant tension between him and Caleb had consumed his thoughts, even outside the classroom. The sleepless nights, the growing sense of helplessness, the feeling that his career, his life, was unraveling, all of it was tied to Caleb. The boy's face haunted him, always laughing, always mocking. It was no longer just a student-teacher conflict, it had become something personal, something far darker. Samuel's pride, his dignity, was at stake, and he was desperate to reclaim it. As he gathered his things to leave, Samuel noticed Caleb outside, leaning against his car in the parking lot, a familiar scene by now. Caleb wasn't alone, he was with a couple of friends, laughing and talking loudly, as if the world belonged to them. Caleb had always exuded an air of confidence, that easy charisma that made him so popular among his peers. But to Samuel, it was insufferable. He could feel the rage building in his chest as he watched from the window, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Without thinking, Samuel stood up, his movements mechanical, driven by a force he didn't fully understand. He had no clear plan in mind as he made his way out of the building and across the parking lot, only a growing need to confront Caleb, to finally put an end to the power struggle that had been suffocating him. As he approached, Caleb spotted him and nudged one of his friends, muttering something under his breath that caused the others to snicker. Caleb's eyes gleamed with mischief, as if he knew exactly what was coming. Samuel stopped a few feet away, standing rigidly, his posture tense. The chill in the air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, flooded with thoughts of every insult. Every time Caleb had undermined him, each moment building into a crescendo of frustration and anger. Caleb, unfazed, continued to lean casually against the car, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture dripping with nonchalance. He didn't need to say anything to provoke Samuel. The smirk on his face was enough. Samuel stared at Caleb, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with something close to hatred. It wasn't just about disrespect anymore, it was about power. For months, Caleb had chipped away at Samuel's authority, reducing him to a figure of ridicule in front of the class. Now, standing in the fading light of the parking lot, Samuel could feel the last remnants of his patience slipping away. He had tried everything: discipline, reasoning, even empathy, but none of it had worked. Caleb had pushed him too far, and now there was no turning back. Caleb's friends, sensing the tension, slowly began to back away, their laughter fading as they exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen Caleb and Samuel butt heads before, but something about this moment felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet before the storm. Without a word, the friends mumbled excuses and walked away, leaving Caleb and Samuel alone in the empty lot. The silence that followed was suffocating. The confrontation was inevitable. Caleb remained where he was, defiant as always, his smirk never faltering. He didn't move, didn't flinch. As Samuel took another step closer, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. For a moment, neither of them said anything, but the weight of their history hung in the air. Months of escalating conflict, of insults traded, of power slipping through Samuel's fingers and into Caleb's hands. It was a silent war, one that Samuel had been losing for too long. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice low and tightly controlled, though every word was laced with barely restrained fury. He confronted Caleb about his behavior, his disrespect, and the way he had undermined Samuel's authority time and again. The words poured out of him, sharp and pointed, each one meant to pierce through the wall of indifference that Caleb had built around himself. Samuel demanded an explanation, demanded accountability, but Caleb's response was nothing more than a lazy shrug. The dismissal, the utter lack of concern in Caleb's expression, broke something inside of Samuel. He had been holding on to the last threads of his control, but in that moment they snapped. Caleb's nonchalance was like a match struck against Samuel's raw nerves, igniting the rage that had been festering for months. Samuel stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his fists clenched at his sides. Caleb's smirk only widened. He enjoyed seeing Samuel this way, flustered, angry, on the edge of losing control. To him, it was just another victory in their ongoing battle. He knew he could push Samuel further, and the thrill of it was intoxicating. Caleb made another mocking comment, his voice dripping with sarcasm, his tone so casual it was as if he didn't even care about the consequences. That was it. The moment Samuel had feared, the moment when he would no longer be able to hold back. All the frustration, all the anger, the humiliation had boiled over in an instant. Samuel lunged forward, grabbing Caleb by the collar of his jacket, pulling him close enough to see the flicker of surprise in Caleb's eyes. For a brief moment, Caleb's bravado faltered, and he realized that this wasn't a game anymore. The world seemed to narrow around them, the parking lot fading into the background as the confrontation became a violent struggle. Caleb, caught off guard, tried to push Samuel away, but Samuel's grip was firm, fueled by months of pent-up rage. They stumbled backward, the gravel crunching under their feet as the scuffle escalated. Caleb fought back, his instinct for self-preservation kicking in, but Samuel was relentless. The confrontation turned physical, both of them locked in a chaotic, desperate struggle. Samuel's mind was clouded by the weight of everything he had been carrying for so long: his failure to control Caleb, the loss of his authority, the fear that his career, his identity, was crumbling before his eyes. In that moment, he wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't thinking at all. The rage had taken over, and there was no room for reason, no space for the rational part of his mind that might have stopped him. They collided with the side of Caleb's car, the sound of the impact echoing through the empty lot. Samuel, consumed by his need to finally win this battle, pushed harder, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he struggled to maintain control. Caleb, still reeling from the shock of Samuel's aggression, tried to break free, but the force of Samuel's anger was overwhelming. It wasn't until Caleb slipped, his foot catching on the uneven ground, that the struggle took a deadly turn. As he fell backward, his head struck the edge of the concrete curb with a sickening crack, the sound cutting through the night like a gunshot. Samuel froze, the world suddenly crashing back into focus as he looked down at Caleb, who lay motionless on the ground. The adrenaline drained from Samuel's body all at once, leaving him hollow, numb. For a moment, everything was silent. The world seemed to stand still, as if time itself had paused in the wake of the violence. Samuel stared at Caleb, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The boy's eyes were closed, his body limp, blood pooling beneath his head where it had struck the curb. The confrontation, the rage, the power struggle, it was all over. But the cost was far greater than Samuel could have ever imagined. The parking lot, once filled with the sounds of laughter and life, was now a scene of tragedy. Samuel's chest heaved as he stood over Caleb's lifeless form, his heart pounding in his ears. He had wanted control, wanted to reclaim his authority, but now all he felt was the crushing weight of what he had done. The confrontation, once just a boiling point of frustration, had ended in irreversible violence, and there was no going back. In the days that followed Caleb's death, Silver Creek became a town held captive by shock and disbelief. The small, quiet town, where gossip usually centered around church events or high school football games, was suddenly plunged into a tragedy that no one could have anticipated. Samuel Jennings, the respected and beloved history teacher, was at the center of it all. He had been the last person anyone would have suspected to be involved in such an act of violence, but now, the illusion of control and stability that had defined him for so many years had shattered beyond repair. Samuel, in the aftermath of that terrible night, descended into a darkness so deep that it consumed every part of him. The moment Caleb's body had hit the ground, everything that Samuel had been, his identity as a teacher, his reputation, his sense of purpose, had crumbled. He had crossed a line that he couldn't uncross, and he knew it. The immediate shock of what he had done left him frozen, standing over Caleb's motionless body in the parking lot, his mind blank except for the ringing silence that followed the fatal blow. In that moment, Samuel was paralyzed. He couldn't think, couldn't move, as the reality of his actions weighed down on him like a crushing force. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring at Caleb's lifeless form, his mind trying to make sense of it all, but it couldn't. It wouldn't. It was too much, too surreal to be real. But it was real. Caleb's blood, pooling darkly on the pavement beneath his head, was proof of that. Eventually, Samuel stumbled back, his body acting on instinct as his mind remained in a fog. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he could feel the adrenaline fading, leaving him weak and nauseous. He looked down at his hands, as if expecting to see them stained with guilt, with blood. But they were clean physically, at least. Inside, he was unraveling. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his legs felt like they might give out from under him at any moment. In the haze of panic and disbelief, Samuel did the only thing he could think of. He fled. He turned and walked away from the scene, his legs moving on autopilot, as he left Caleb's body behind in the cold, dark parking lot. His mind was still racing, the full weight of what had just happened not yet fully registering. He felt like he was floating, disconnected from his own body, as if watching himself from afar. The streets of Silver Creek were empty as he made his way home, the quiet suburban houses now feeling like ghostly sentinels in the night. The familiar landscape of his life seemed alien, distorted by the horror of what had just taken place. When he reached his small, neat house on the outskirts of town, Samuel collapsed into a chair in the living room, his thoughts still a chaotic jumble. He was alone, truly alone, in a way that he had never felt before. For years, Samuel had lived a solitary life, but now, that solitude felt like a punishment, a prison of his own making. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now pressed down on him like a suffocating weight. His mind raced as he tried to think about what to do next, But nothing made sense anymore. How could it, when he had just taken the life of one of his students? The guilt began to set in, creeping over him like a shadow, slowly at first, but growing heavier with each passing hour. He couldn't escape the image of Caleb's body lying in the parking lot, his face pale, eyes closed, blood seeping from his head. Samuel had wanted control, had wanted respect, but now he had nothing. He had lost everything in a single, violent moment, and there was no way to undo it. The rage that had driven him to confront Caleb was gone, replaced by a hollow, gnawing despair that ate away at him from the inside. Days passed in a blur, and Samuel withdrew even further into himself. He couldn't go to school, he couldn't face the students, the staff, or anyone in town. He avoided calls and texts, ignoring the growing concern from his colleagues. His absence was noted, but in the chaos of the investigation surrounding Caleb's death, Samuel's behavior was, at first, overlooked. The town was in mourning, struggling to make sense of what had happened. No one knew yet who was responsible for Caleb's death, but whispers began to circulate, and the sense of unease in the air was palpable. The investigation into Caleb's death began quickly, with the local police working to piece together the events of that night. At first, there was little to go on. Caleb had been found alone in the parking lot, no witnesses to the final moments of his life. But as the days passed, small details began to emerge. People remembered seeing Samuel lingering in the parking lot after school, and some of Caleb's friends recalled the escalating tension between the two. Slowly, suspicion began to fall on Samuel, though no one wanted to believe that the quiet, dedicated teacher could be involved in such a brutal crime. Meanwhile, Samuel's mental state continued to deteriorate. He rarely left the house, subsisting on black coffee and the occasional sandwich. Though food tasted like ash in his mouth, he barely slept, his nights filled with nightmares in which Caleb's face haunted him, twisted with accusation. During the few hours of restless sleep he managed, he would wake in a cold sweat, the memory of Caleb's body, lying in the parking lot, playing on an endless loop in his mind. Every moment, whether awake or asleep, was consumed by guilt, by the crushing weight of what he had done. In his isolation, Samuel began to unravel. His thoughts turned darker, more fragmented. He couldn't reconcile the man he had been, the respected teacher, the trusted mentor, with the man who had killed a student in a fit of rage. The two versions of himself seemed worlds apart, yet they were the same person, and that realization only deepened his sense of self-loathing. The walls of his house, once a sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in on him, trapping him in a prison of his own guilt. As the investigation continued, the evidence against Samuel began to mount. Witnesses came forward with stories of his increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to Caleb's death, of the heated arguments and confrontations that had taken place. The police began to focus their attention on Samuel, piecing together the timeline of that fateful night. It was only a matter of time before they knocked on his door. When they finally did, Samuel was a shell of the man he had once been. He barely resisted as they took him into custody, his mind numb to the reality of the situation. The arrest, when it came, was almost a relief, a release from the endless torment of his guilt. As the police read him his rights, Samuel stared blankly ahead, his mind elsewhere, replaying the events that had led him to this moment. The town of Silver Creek was left reeling from the revelation. News of Samuel's arrest spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. People who had once respected him were left in disbelief, unable to comprehend how a man who had been trusted with the education of their children could have committed such a heinous act. Parents who had once praised Samuel for his dedication now spoke of him with disgust, and students who had admired him were left grappling with the betrayal of their trust. For Samuel, there was no escaping the darkness that had consumed him. His once orderly life, built on discipline and control, had crumbled, leaving him adrift in a sea of guilt and regret. As he sat in his cell, awaiting trial, the only thing he had left were his memories of Caleb, of the classroom, of the life he had once had. But those memories, once a source of pride, were now tainted by the violence that had destroyed everything. The descent into darkness was complete. Samuel Jennings, once the beloved teacher of Silver Creek, was now a murderer, his life forever stained by the choices he had made in a moment of uncontrollable rage. There was no redemption, no forgiveness, only the weight of what he had done and the knowledge that he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. The quiet, solitary existence he had once valued was gone, replaced by a darkness that would never lift. The town was left reeling from the revelation. Samuel Jennings, the man they had trusted, had killed one of his own students. The quiet order of Silver Creek was shattered, and the once respected teacher now stood as a symbol of betrayal and darkness. There was no redemption for Samuel, no explanation that could justify the horror of what he had done. His life, once defined by discipline and control, had unraveled completely, leaving behind only the aftermath of a tragedy that no one could forget.